great. So it gives me extremely great pleasure to introduce Yevgeniy Dodis. Among his least accomplishment was being my advisor and teaching me everything I know.
The most one.
So Yevgeniy is a professor at NYU. He's a fellow of the IUCR. He has gotten the Test of Time Awards for 2 works, one on fuzzy extractors and one on verifiable random functions. He has a number of other awards I'm not going to talk about, going all the way back to his undergrad when he was a Putnam Fellow in '95.
All right, that's significant, yeah.
And he's worked, he's incredibly prolific, has over 150 publications, has worked in a large number of areas in cryptography. And a lot of his work, especially, is on the problem of randomness in cryptography, and good randomness, random number generation. And that's what we're going to hear about today. So.
Okay. Well.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I don't know if this works actually, but hopefully it does. Okay, sorry, the clicker doesn't work, but let me use this minute to say something at the expense of my talk. I'm really excited about ITC conference, and I guess my selection bias works in the opposite direction of where it should be. But you know, because you're all here. But I really hope that the conference will continue. I mean, I submitted like 2 papers here to be presented tomorrow. I hope you guys will send strong papers, even if they might appear at you know, other venues, because it's an exciting conference, and I hope the tradition will continue. So, all right. So, if I can figure out how the clicker works, that would be good news. But let's see, maybe now. All right, awesome. Okay, so for this audience, I'll go through the introduction very quickly. We all know that randomness is important everywhere. It's definitely important in cryptography. And, you know, for all kinds of things, most importantly, secret keys have to be random, encryption should be randomized, like replay attacks, blah, 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 anonymity, unpredictability, noise differential privacy, even blockchains, whatever it is. You know, I'm sure they, you know, using all kinds of proofs and stuff, snarks, PCPs, whatever. So important stuff. So the question is, and bad randomness also leads to attacks. So I'm not qualified to talk about this attack. So the most important point of this slide, I was even somehow involved in a couple of those things. For those who know me, I'm not really, I'm usually proving things as opposed to attacking things. But the bottom line is, when it fails, even though it might be hard to break, when it fails and fails in a pretty spectacular fashion, so we should try to design things in a manner which is good. So where do we get this randomness for cryptography? And the answer is pseudo-random number generators. And for this talk, it might be slightly different than the notion of David is accustomed to talk about, but you know, related. So what is a pseudo-random generator that is needed to generate randomness for you know, real-world applications? It's basically this staples button. So we have this store called Staples, and it's famous for selling these red buttons. Whenever you need something done, you just press a button and stuff gets done. So if you buy this PRNG button, you just press a button, and what happens is a random number comes in. You press another button, another random number comes in, and so on. And they're all uniform, independent, and fresh. So from the perspective of user, it's really the simplest interface, like compared to like non-malleable commitments and all kinds of beautiful things that we do, like multi-party computation. Pretty simple interface, right? But still, we need to, you know, we'd like to look inside this button. Somebody needs to produce it. So in reality, this comes from what is called entropy sources, and I'm not talking quantum. Of course, yeah, quantum you can have inherent randomness. Most typical one in operating systems is timing of interrupts, and none of those are exactly this. They're kind of non-uniform, non-independent, non-fresh. Sometimes you can even say adversarials, and when you want to do proofs, you would like to even protect against adversarial sources of randomness. So anyway, so we need to build this kind of box, look inside this box. So I want to start this kind of a more global picture of what I'm looking for. So if you look at the state of cryptography, there are all kinds of practical things that we slowly started to build. You started with, let's see, so they can see my own slides easier. You know, like AES, block ciphers, authenticated encryption, digital signatures. All of them started in some ad hoc fashion. People had attacks and fixes and so on, schemes that survived, some who got reduced to nice assumptions, and eventually they even led to standards. Like there are a bunch of standards, and you can debate if someone like for signatures, maybe we can do better than DSA and so on. I don't know if there should be finalists announced today for post-quantum. I didn't check the news yet. Maybe it's announced, but you can debate if you like as a process or not, but it's pretty established. So by and large, if you need to develop your own kind of block cipher or just use a block cipher, you're going to use AES. You're not going to go to this old days and do something ad hoc and crazy. So where does RNG stand? So RNG in kind of comparison in a pretty, I would like to argue, primitive state, even though there is some standards, there were a bunch of papers in the interest of time, and this, for this audience, I will not go into criticism of the standard, but it's kind of inconsistent, ad hoc, sometimes contradictory, which is the opposite of what the standard should be. So what we would like to do kind of as a cryptographic community is to move it at least to some less primitive state, at least somewhat more serious. But I would like to argue, and I don't know if I'll convince you or not, hopefully, given the simplicity of the Staples interface, just press a button compared to things like encryption, signatures, this interactive kind of primitive, it could even go here. It could be the most powerful of them all. And basically, maybe we can understand it better than all of those other primitives. So this is kind of the goal of this line of work. Okay, so very briefly, let's talk about operating systems PRNGs. They are not built according to any standard. So essentially, the point is we don't have like a very workable standard. So right now, if you want to deploy PRNG in like Windows or Mac OS and so on, you're not going to use any of that standard. They all found ad hoc solutions, not so ad hoc, but they all found complete solutions. So and one of the things that will come up, like good ones, some of the ones that we believe are good and community heuristically like, they use some cryptographic hash function somewhere. Okay, so couple of case studies briefly before we go to more theoretical things. So Linux, the famous one is def random. It's pretty complex, ad hoc, heuristic. It has no intuition or modular security proof. In fact, in an early paper, with Daniel and others, like more applied people, we had like this paper at CCS where we found at least theoretical weaknesses, in the Linux RNG. We showed that cannot accumulate entropy. We had some theoretical models and so on, but basically it's clear that it's essentially, when I say garbage, it's garbage from a theoretical perspective. In practice, somehow Linux still works, but we hope to do better. So fast forward 9 years, I'm like very excited about this, even though the work is going a little bit less fast than I would like to. But it's my fault mainly. But so I get this email. I mean, I met Jason Donfield. So he's essentially a guy who is in charge of Linux RNG right now. And I met him at Real World Crypto right before pandemics. And I was like trying to tell him, come on, it's time to retire this garbage and like do something. And he was very sympathetic. And then some who's pandemic started and so on. So anyways, he says, it's like, I'm going to be on NYC. Finally, I have this control. It would be great to do stuff. And then he wrote like literally very thoughtful, detailed, like he read our papers, other papers, things, what I'm thinking. I didn't have time to read. It's like, oh my God, it's like 5-page thing with like his thought of the thing. But he concluded, he says, my goal as a RNG project is to have every component as reasonably proved as possible. So I think it's a kind of a good outcome of this line of work, even though it's still ongoing. And then he, this is part of the expert of the GitHub page for the project. He kind of tries to put everything public. And as I said, he like cites a bunch of papers. I mean, I was lucky enough to co-author, all of these papers, but hopefully they were useful. But yeah, he read it, and this stuff hopefully will be used in the upcoming iteration of Linux RNG. So I think that was exciting. So what about Windows and Apple? They're actually in better shape. They use something which seemed to be much better, even intuitively, even though there was normal formal model. Apple used something called Yarrow, but about to switch to something which is Fortuna-based. We did some analysis of it a few years ago in crypto, saying, basically saying that these designs are pretty good in some theoretical model. Tomorrow, I will not have time to talk about it today, but basically what I'm going to do today, I will end talk essentially on examination of this problem called like premature next problem, and tomorrow Harish will tell you state-of-the-art result about this premature next problem, but there's something kind of some exciting novelty about these attacks that we're going to, hopefully you'll see tomorrow. We analyzed it, we analyzed Fortuna a while back with Daniel, Adi Shamir, and Noah, I think at Crypto, and I think in the upcoming, tomorrow you will hear the latest on this as well. So we also, last year, Crypto and ITC conference this year. Last year, we analyzed something called super fast entropy accumulation. Hopefully, I will have time to talk about it as well. And I would like to say that overall, even though in this kind of case, the design seemed to be pretty good to begin with, and it really influenced a lot of our theoretical papers, there was even some feedback loop. Some of our small improvements, like got back to Apple and Windows, and they kind of slightly tweaked their design to make it consistent with our proofs. So that was kind of exciting. So I'm excited about this work. So this was a little bit of advertisement. So for the rest of the thing, I will switch to PRNG theory and kind of tell you a little bit more about this line of work. Let's stop me at any point. So coming back to our staples button, let's try to look at a simpler problem. So instead of looking at the whole problem of repeated to the random generation and like state compromise and all kinds of those practical issues that we are going to deal with, let's look at a simple problem of one-time extraction. So there is only one string which is coming in from basically one entropy source. So let's change things from beautiful pictures to math notation. So the input is going to be x, extractor is going to be x to x, output is going to be y. And the goal of the attacker is to tell the string, which we'll call y, from uniform. Okay, so this is a very simple task. And the big question is, of course, what assumptions do we make about x to argue security of this? And the holy grail here is to say that for appropriate notion of entropy, which happens to be mean entropy, but doesn't matter for this high level view of this talk, if the entropy is at least like security parameter or something large enough, the output is statistically close to uniform. I mean, possibly computationally close, but yeah, this would be the holy grail. Unfortunately, in this level of generality, this is impossible, even if you want to extract just one bit. So for any extractor, you can basically take a uniform, you can even efficiently sample, you can take a uniform pre-image of 0 or 1, whatever is the larger, and just have a huge entropy source, which kind of maps to 0. So what do we do? I'll probably regret it, but I really love this work. So let me go a little bit of a detour to tell you some of the theoretical results, over here. So the more general question, it leads this impossibility of extraction says, okay, extraction is impossible. Maybe what about general cryptography, right? So maybe we can kind of sideways the extraction route and do something else. So the first question is, can entropy based, let's say encryption, just as a most natural thing, be based on entropy alone? And unfortunately, there is a beautiful paper of McInnes and Pincus, like the first paper of Benny Pincus. I think he is like the most recent ICR fellow, I think, with Yale. So, that's how it started. That's how it's all started from Benny and his master thesis. So I'm sure that influenced the ICR fellow committee. So yeah, he showed that no, in this level of generality, you cannot, let's say, base one bit encryption on, let's say, high entropy, even like something called Santa sources. And then in a series of work at Fox in 04, and then in crypto, we did something kind of more general also for differential privacy, which said that even computational assumptions do not help. So in a pretty strong sense, the answer in this level of generality is negative. And roughly speaking, the way it works is like for any scheme, there is a very high entropy possibly contrived, but there is some high entropy source that efficiently defeats it. And because it's efficiently defeats it, computational assumptions do not help. And it extends to a bunch of other primitives. The other paper, which is a little bit less known, I really like this work, so I'm going to spend a slide on this. We can ask a more ambitious question. We can say, even a more ambitious negative result, does encryption, for example, encryption or other privacy tasks for cryptography inherently require extractable randomness, right? So, obviously, you have a source which can be deterministically extracted, you can use one-time path, so this is good. And here, we gave kind of two answers to this question, complementary, no and yes. So the no answer was in, I think 2002, that paper that basically my Erdos number 2 paper with Joel Spencer, we created an artificial source separating one bit encryption from one bit extraction. So in principle, maybe cryptography doesn't require true randomness, but then unfortunately, a few years later, with Kyle Bosley, we unfortunately realized that this is just because, the numbers 1 and 1 was like, just too close together. So once you just, look at practical setting, unfortunately, the answer is positive. So we showed that the moment you can encrypt, even like if you have an n-bit key and you can encrypt it, just log n bits. Let's say, one-time pad would encrypt n bits with n-bit key. Just like, a tiny amount of something, you can encrypt, growing number of bits with even exponentially big key, you already, the source has to be extractable. So, and And the way we are going to show this result, I'll spend a slide of it just kind of for entertainment, because otherwise I have no way to present this result anyway, so you guys have to be witnesses of it. So let me give you a one-slide summary how this result goes, just for, yeah. No, so to some extent, so if you like efficiently sample, so a lot of those results, so yeah, that's the trick. So the attacker is efficient, but the source, and now I think there are some results for efficiently sampleable source. So Mohammed had some stronger result. So the station is more murky, but for some super kind of, restricted sources, the results go away. You can do deterministic extraction, but yeah, it's some of it will a little bit come up towards the very end of the stock, but yeah, for now it's like, yeah, good question. Anyway, so let me give you a little bit one way, so you can teach it in your crypto classes. I think it's like a good exercise. I don't know. I never done it as an exercise, but I think you can do it. So here is, I think, an encryption implies extraction. So we're going to use a positive result, a really cool result of Travis and Vadan, that if you have a family of 2 to the n distributions, each of those distributions has high entropy individually, then you can extract, it is deterministically extractable. You lose basically double logarithmic in the number of distribution. Log of 2 to the n becomes log n. So if for our setting of parameters, if you have an exponential number of distributions, they are deterministically extractable. The problem with high entropy sources are like double exponentials. That's why we have impossibility results. So this is a cool result. I will not tell you how to prove it. It's not my result, but we're going to use a positive result. Yeah. You can view it as a non-explicit thing. Sure. For now, let's say it's non-explicit. I will show you this. But so to me, it's so in complexity theory, it's non-explicit, but in practice, it is explicit because you just sample once and for all using like sunspots, TWS and whatever, like NOS independent hash function, and you're done forever, right? So to me, so it means like practically explicit, theoretically, yeah, theoretically we still need more stuff to do. Yeah, there is a paper to be written here, I'm sure. Now let's take any encryption scheme. And this is an encryption scheme using a gamma bit message with an n bit key, okay? And assume it's secure for some family of distributions, right? So this is our result. We have some family of distributions that magically allows to do encryption. So what it means no matter what keys attacker, what distributions attacker chooses from this family, they are good to go. I mean, the encryption will be semantically secure. You cannot distinguish encryptions of 2 messages. So the first observation, rather than showing that this family is deterministically extractable, will show that the family where you encrypt with a key, a fixed message 0 is deterministically extractable, right? It's deterministic processing. So to argue that this is extractable is enough to argue that this is extractable. So this is just to simplify matters. And then I'm going to define an auxiliary family, a green family, capital F. You can see it kind of matches up with a color. So this will be a family which is the following. You take a uniform message. So you're kind of sweeping what is random, key versus message. You take a uniform message and encrypt it under a fixed key. And then, you go over all keys, right? So let's see. I claim that this family satisfies our positive result. It has 2 to the n distributions because there are 2 to the n keys. And each of those distributions have entropy gamma. Why? Because encryption has to be decryptable by correctness of decryption. That if under the fixed key you encrypt different messages, you should get different results. So all of them, so basically it will have mean entropy gamma. So basically this family is deterministically extractable, we're in good shape. But now we're like almost done, except you see there is a mismatch. We can extract from here, but we want to extract from here. All right, so there is only one thing we can do, which is to use security of encryption. We haven't used security of encryption anywhere. So the way we'll use security of encryption is say, listen, let's look at any distribution here, encryption K of 0. By semantic security, nobody can tell apart encryption of 0 by encryption of a uniform message. And this is a mixture. Now, effectively, security, I think about it, I'm giving the key for free. I'm giving the key K for free to the attacker. And I'm saying this is a mixture of these, distributions from this family. And because this family is deterministically extractable, and extractors are closed about, under convex combinations, it means that this is also the same extractor that works for this family will work for this family. All right, so this is the end of the proof anyway. A small detour relevant for the rest of the talk, but I couldn't resist. I don't know if there are any questions, but.
So wait, so this argument won't be complicated. Starts with
No, statistical, the same statistical. Why? Yeah, this result is statistical. Everything is statistical here. Yeah, for computation it also works, but yeah. Yeah. Not so exponentials like epsilon becomes epsilon plus delta. So I'm saying if my security of encryption is statistical, so I'm saying there are computational kind of corollaries of this result, but let's say we can define everything in a statistical regime, like, one-time pad is a statistically secure symmetric encryption scheme. So the easiest to interpret this result is everything is statistical. It's like a symmetric encryption, everything is statistical. Computationally, it also works in this semi-explicit regime because our extractor, if encryption is efficient and everything is computationally secure, the extractors that we apply here is also efficient, it's like canvas independent hash function. So there is a corollary in this. Yeah, sure.
Testing whether to have a good extractor.
Yeah, testing. So this is a one-time procedure. Yeah, so this is a non-explicit step. So yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good caveat. But yeah, so probably there is something, but anyway, at least to some extent, modulo this explicitness, thing, hopefully it gives you some idea of this kind of detours that to some extent there is this negative thing that, in a pretty strong sense, from general entropy sources, not only we cannot extract, but we cannot do cryptography. But now forget about cryptography, we're back to extraction. So just a small detour that we'll regret about later, but anyway. So they're not disjoint, but generally there are 4 workarounds of this kind of mode. One workaround is to look at the seeded constructions. The other is cryptographic hash functions. The third weakened class of sources, so weakened security. For example, like efficiently sampleable would be weakened class of sources. And I'll talk very briefly about it. And one of the cool things about it, you can write papers about all of them kind of independently with different motivations. When we looked at this problem of practical random number generators and operating systems, like in building actually the practical RNG, you will actually see that all 4 of these relaxations came in different places, in the final design for totally different reasons. It was kind of somewhat fascinating that it looks like a simple staples button, but somehow for various reasons that you will see, all 4 of them played some role. So let's start with the cleanest one, which is like the famous seeded extractors of Nissan Zuckerman, David. So this is the idea. I'll go quickly because everybody probably for this audience know. Rather than insisting the extractor is deterministic, we allow this public seed. But the point is, it still helps you extract essentially secret randomness. So the canonical application for this thing, forget about maybe like RNG, is a key derivation function. So you have a secret source X, maybe your fingerprints, or like a difficult key exchange element in some weird group. And so this is secret, and then you have a public S that everybody knows. And this public S helps you to extract secret randomness. And for now, everything is statistical over here. And the key property of this, because everything is statistical, is the entropy loss. How much entropy? So intuitively, the most I can extract is mean entropy. I'm going to extract a little bit less, so I would like to minimize entropy loss. And there is a famous Radhakrishnan-Tashma bound that says, unfortunately, as the entropy loss is at least 2 times security parameter. It's 2 times log 1 epsilon, which from complexity theory seems like 0, but in practice, unfortunately, it's non-trivial for practical thing. And of course, there is a famous leftover hash lemma that says that this is actually optimal. So it looks like we are done, so we can get our prize and go home. Unfortunately, for practical purposes, I have some papers which I will not talk about dealing with the large seed of the leftover hash lemma, and of course there are improvements extractors which have shorter seed. But I want to concentrate on the entropy loss here. And in the interest of time, I'll skip the practical motivation and just jump right into the results. The point is that, as I said, this 2 log 1 of epsilon is for practical applications, it becomes like, 128 bits from your fingerprints of entropy. Fingerprints don't have entropy, elliptic curve elements. We try to make elliptic curve as small as possible. So this is an issue, and we would like to save it. And one question that we asked in this line of work: do we need to derive statistically random R? Right, that's a definition of extractor. And a surprising, well, not surprising answer is yes. For one-time pad, you need a statistically random R. It's kind of almost if and only by definition. But for a lot of cryptographic applications, turns out the answer is no. It's like there is automatically from the security or security gain for this cryptographic applications, you don't need statistically random key. You can get these weaker properties. So we have this series of works starting crypto 11 and up to Eurocrypt 14, like paper with Daniel and Krzysztof, that shows us the answer is that we can actually do better. We can improve the entropy loss, and the key insight is there is a difference between. So the key insight is there is a difference between extraction and key derivation, and it would be so when I gave so this is a condensed version of my summer school in Malta earlier this summer. So I stopped here and I kind of took a detour for like literally hour and a half to talk about this thing. So here I'm going to condense everything in maybe 2 slides, but just to give you the high level idea of what we did. But please ask questions. I would love to tell you more. So this is kind of the results. At least this is a table of results, and maybe I'll a little bit talk about the ideas, but not too much. So let's look at the state of the art before this attempt to minimize entropy loss. So leftover hash lemma, the key derivation function was very simple. It's a universal hash function. The entropy loss is 2 log 1 of epsilon. There is no assumption needed. And here, I skipped some slides, but here I said, listen, I want to derive an AES key, which is 128-bit key with security 2 to the minus 64. So it's 128 plus 64 times 2, another 128. So it means that basically the entropy of the source is 256. So in a computation, if I'm happy with the random oracle model, a random oracle is basically a free converter from unpredictability to pseudo-randomness, right? Essentially, as long as you cannot predict the source, you didn't query random oracle on some point, it's uniform. So it gives you basically a one-to-one conversions, like stable coin, right? I'm just kidding, talking about blockchain, applications. It's like one-to-one conversions from entropy to randomness, right? So, so that gives you 0. Of course, it's a heuristic, but basically, I just need 128 bits of entropy and get it done. Yeah.
So here you are assuming some bounds of the Gaussian square.
Yeah, so it requires some calculation. So I kind of cheated. So because you take very with random oracles, there is a computational security. So there is a little like 2-line computations that I hit. So yeah, I kind of assume the bound on the number of queries and I upper bound by the running time of the attacker. So there is a little bit of calculation where I can justify, but you're right, it's not completely obvious. When I took a detour, there was like a little slide showing it. But yeah, it turns out to be true. I have a justification, just not on the slide. But yeah, it's a good question. So in the first kind of this series of papers, we said, you know what? Without changing the hash function, the paper was actually called Leftover Hash Lemma Revisited. We said, take the standard leftover hash lemma. And it turns out that for these applications that we called square-friendly applications, maybe I don't have a slide on it, but I'll tell you in a second what it is. It includes all unpredictability applications like digital signature max, like identification schemes or things like that, but also a prominent class of privacy applications, but not all. It doesn't include pseudorandom generation of pseudorandom functions, but it includes semantically secure encryption. Never mind how, it's like it's easy to check. But for these applications, you can actually have the entropy loss. You can get log 1 of epsilon, so in a concrete sense, it will be 192 bits. And yeah, the square-friendly applications, I guess, yeah, maybe I should have had a backup slide. So yeah, maybe let me just in the interest of time, because this is still, so basically I'm starting from very theoretical works and then going to real world RNGs. So this stuff will be marginally used, not, because we don't want to have a seed, it will not be a no-go. So if you have time, if you're interested, I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but yeah, it's just derail a little bit. Anyway, so there is a rich class of applications where we have the entropy loss for this thing. Then if you say, oh, I want like all applications which are computationally secure, we can throw a PRG and basically as a special case of square-friendly application, derive a square-friendly key derivation function, never mind what it is, but basically we can get the same result at the cost of an extra PRG application. But yeah, they require computational assumption. And finally, the result, which is the least practical but the most surprising to us in this latest paper, we said from predictability applications, we cannot quite go with like pairwise independence, universal hash, but if you have a little bit higher wise independence, like security parameter wise independence, so not really practical, but still kind of cool that you can do it, the entropy loss is only like log 1 of epsilon, basically nothing. So, and this is not just asymptotic, in concrete terms, we get like 138 bits here. So that was, at least in theory, kind of surprising result. So, so this is obviously, I'm not doing justice to this line of work, but just to give you a summary, this is all I wanted to say. I think this is all I wanted to say. Oh, no, okay. Next slide, I wanted to say, So yeah, this is all I wanted to say about this line of work, except in the next slide, I will tell you why this is all I wanted to say about it. Yeah. Oh, like signature scheme, anything. So yeah, that separation is easy. So anytime where you say you want that when you define the advantage of attacker as probability of something, probability of forged signature, probability recovering the key, versus privacy application where probability, whether it's 0 or 1, it's like where you don't subtract a half. Privacy application subtract a half, predictability you don't subtract a half. So that's the square friendly is a little bit harder to define, so I will not do it. So applications to PNG, on the one hand, the answer is yes. In our original paper that criticized Linux with Daniel, we actually overcame, we did these attacks, but we also had a model of entropy accumulation. We introduced something called entropy accumulation is important for random number generators. And we actually had the model, and we had the seeded model, which basically says that random number generator will have a random seed initialized somewhere by a trusted party, and the attacker will know the seed, the distinguisher will know the seed, but the entropy source will not. So basically, we kind of we separated the attacker into two parties. One who actually produces entropy sources cannot know the seed, and the other who can, but that breaks. So obviously in practice, so in practice, there are these two issues. The first issue is kind of not a big deal. Well, you build a random number generator, but you need a random seed to start it. As I said, that's maybe not a big deal. Fine, you trust maybe Google, I don't know, even though there are questions with like backdoors and stuff. But the bigger problem is all these results, the reasons they achieve such cool small entropy loss and so on, is because the source has to be independent of the seed. And for long-term like operating system and so on, which is like used by thousands of applications, it's just like unrealistic that the seed will never leak. So it's just nobody can do it. And indeed, if you talk to like this guy Jason or anybody who built like a practical RNG like Niels Ferguson, they will say, "Oh my God, it's like there is no way I have to use a cryptographic hash function somewhere they designed because once the assumption fails, most of these extractors are information theoretic, and for this information theoretic thing is just a bunch of parities and so on. So when they break in this completely spectacular fashion. Well, if you kind of break some cryptographic hash function design, you need to invert SHA and things like that. So nobody in the same state of mind would use, unfortunately, these extractors. So this brings us to the second kind of part of this talk. Let's see if I'm doing it in time. I think it's actually not too bad, but about using cryptographic hash functions. So the important part of it, they're seedless. I mean, yeah, fine. You can talk about the initialization reactor of SHA-3 or something, but we'll model it as synkless. And we think they work in practice and they analyze in the ideal models. And so let's start with something which is really folklore. And when I start usually these things, people are confused. It's like trivial. Why are you like saying that this is like a big deal? But you'll see there is something non-trivial here. So let me explain what is non-trivial. So let's start with a trivial setting. So we have a source of mean entropy gamma, and G is a random oracle. The attacker has a Dakshita set limited number of queries to the random oracle, makes few queries, and has to distinguish G of X from random. Trivial result, union bound. The chance, the only chance is to query the random oracle on X. Probability Q times 2 to the minus delta. Amazing. Random oracle works as an extractor, and so on. But of course, implicitly, the way it is stated, like this distribution X is assumed to be like a standard distribution, and then some random oracle is sampled externally, so that's why I call it oracle independent sources. So yes, it works if the source can never depend on anything related to SHA-3. So from theoretical standpoint, it's completely ridiculous, right? You went from like leftover hash lemma, like universal hash functions, to an exponential seed for kind of no good theoretical reason. And from practical standpoint, it's really unrealistic. For example, RNG runs in a computer, everybody is using hash functions. The timing of interrupts, RNG causes its own interrupts, they depend on the hash function. So it's kind of clear that even though in practice probably it's good enough, and indeed it works, but it's clear that not by this reasoning, right? So let's try to look, generalize and say, what, in all fairness, we need to define, if you use a random oracle, it's better that the sampler also could use a random oracle, otherwise it's really unfair. And now you will see even the notion of entropy is not completely clear. So let me very briefly demonstrate it. So you say, okay, you can imagine the following experiment. The attacker calls random oracle and outputs the source X. Then the attacker, the challenger also evaluates random oracle, extractor is G of X, and says, hey, let's say X has mean entropy, whatever, gamma, no problem. And then you ask the attacker to distinguish. Obviously, this game is ridiculous. The attacker knows X, he can just call G of X. So you say, okay, this is by itself ridiculous. So we have to force the attacker to forget something. So one way you can say, the attacker output X, but immediately after output X, the attacker has to forget something. So it has to have a state sigma. So X conditional sigma should have some entropy, and then only the attacker gets a challenge, right? But of course, this also doesn't work for multiple reasons. But for example, one reason for the attacker can just output G of 0 as a source, and it is essentially randomness of random oracle kind of in a cheating way as the randomness of the source. But in reality, we want really entropy of interrupts. We just use random oracle for like technical reasons. So you can say, you know what, let's condition. Okay, so there is no stuff to be done. Let me tell you the right solution right away in the interest of time. So it turns out the right solution for this thing, which actually works in a pretty elegant way, is to condition on the list of random oracle queries as sample. So if you condition on the list of random oracle queries, as you'll see, this actually overcomes the impossibility result and turns out to be the right definition. And the intuition is that the entropy comes externally, not because of random oracle interaction, but it can depend on the random oracle interaction. This is kind of the philosophy. And in fact, you can like looking at this result, you can reprove the same theorem, basically the same proof and the same bound works, but now finally the set of sources is a realistic set of sources, or at least it can be allowed to depend. So it's not very hard to see. I'll leave it as an exercise that if X has to have entropy conditioning on the random oracle queries, for example, if the attacker has a random oracle query on X, basically the entropy immediately can go down to like a trivial number, like at most log Q and so on. So basically we'll see that everything kind of works out. So I did that. Oh yeah, so and I want to mention, so to connect it with leftover hash lemma and the seeded extractors, I want to say we also have an information theoretic version of this thing where in the first stage, the attacker makes Q queries, then outputs the source, it has to have entropy. After the challenge, the attacker can basically learn the entire random oracle. This just means, yeah, like nature probably didn't call like SHA for like the zillion of things, but maybe something of SHA is broken or something like that. We still want security for this like powerful attackers afterwards. And here's a bound actually. We can get the same kind of bound. It's like a little bit of a subtle proof, not very hard, but basically we have a term which is this leftover hash lemma term over here. And this kind of comes from leftover hash lemma technique. So these techniques kind of came together here as well. Yeah, you know? You can view it as a seed, so G will be the seed. So yeah, so here you can think of G as a seed. It's just at the time of when the attacker samples the source, it couldn't learn the entire seed, so you couldn't make it too dependent by this condition, and then you learn the seed. And that's why I was like saying, this is my excuse to say that at least in practical RNGs, seeded extractors also played some small role, in this information theoretic version. But now we're moving towards justifying practical designs. So are we done with extraction? These will be repeated questions throughout this talk. The answer is no. And the reason is there is no monolithic random oracle in the real world. So really, if you want to have, there was like a toy problem just to justify and explain how to model, properly entropy in these idealized models. In reality, what you need to do is an online extractor. So the source comes really slowly. Each interrupt might have like 0.2 bits of entropy, but there are like millions of interrupts, and eventually they accumulate this entropy. And there is no way you can remember it all. So you have to have a compact state that like absorbs it as a sponge absorbs this like drops of water and gets like fuller and fuller of water. So this is called entropy accumulation. So you need to have formula procedure refresh that takes a state and the next little input, outputs a new state. And because here I'm talking about extraction, like one-time extraction, finally when you process all those guys, you have this procedure finalized. There's one procedure finalized which actually outputs the randomness, okay? So notice that only the syntax is fine-grained, the security is, the security notion is the same. Anyway, this is like a pseudocode of what is happening. You just iteratively refresh and then you finalize, so nothing really changes. The thing that changes now, remember, we want to do idealized models. So now we would like to say there is like a little ideal object, like a little random oracle or ideal cipher or something like that, that everybody has access to. Both the extractor and also, I didn't put the security games attacker, obviously, right? So here's an example. A very popular example is CBC Mac, right? So CBC Mac is actually very popular. It's like basically does this thing. So this is a refresh function, and this is, you just output, the final output of the CBC Mac. And this is like a public random permutations, like let's say AES with a fixed key or something like that. So this is actually proven secure in an early paper of ours in Crypto 4, but in the Oracle independent setting. And there they really concentrated on entropy loss and so on. So it was kind of trivial that it works, but just the exact security was non-trivial. It's actually one of the modes suggested in some standards that I said, and it's also actually explicitly used in RNG on the site our paper for justification of this, right? So I can say, okay, that's a great thing. It's a super popular thing. Everybody's using it. One of the simplest possible designs. Is it secure in the Oracle dependent setting, right? And somewhat surprisingly, the answer turns out to be no. And I'm debating if I should show the attacks, but what the hell, I'll show you the attack. I think it will, even if you don't get through the context of the talk, I think it's good to get something. So just to show the notion is non-trivial, I will show that this is not a secure construction.
So just to clarify, you're assuming that the min entropy of x1, x2, x3
Together, yeah.
You're not assuming each.
Yeah. So it's actually it's super adversarial. So I'm saying the definition is so simple that it looks like they are making some kind of, but they're actually allowing something ridiculously generous to the attacker. So the attacker really controls everything, and the attacker just has to give me something with total entropy. But the attacker is allowed to give a bunch of zero entropy. In the attacker will give you a bunch of things, one bit of entropy in each thing. You know, fixed random permutation. Yeah. Pi. It's a random permutation. It's an invertible random permutation. It's just like random oracle, but invertible. Yeah. We don't need, so maybe, let me show you that. You will see that under every definition that you can imagine, it's an attack. So maybe that will be, it's like this, Kobayashi when he was like talking about differential privacy attacks. I don't know how to define security, but this will be a blatant insecurity. So let me show that without giving you a definition, it's clear that it will break any definition. Yeah.
So this sounds bad.
Yeah.
Also, you could have, like you said, the timing of the interrupts could depend on the structure of pi itself. So
yeah.
If you're showing that there are attacks even with
yeah.
the adversary authoritative access to pi.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
That look at
yeah, there is a little bit like there is a paper, I guess, with Daniel and Vinod at Eurocube, which is not part of the survey because it goes in a theoretical thing. But yeah, definitely at this level, we will stop. So yeah, we'll kind of, we will not look at these attacks. So you're right. There are attacks. There is something you can do in the standard model, very fine line between feasibility and impossibility. But yeah, here there will be some justification. Not here. This is like insecure. But yeah, absolutely. It's an idealized model, right? So it will be an idealized model, but hopefully it's better to have some reasonable proof in an idealized model, which is consistent with what people do in practice. Or otherwise you'll have to give them something theoretically secure, which they find convincing, which we failed so far, but yeah. So anyway, I'll show you very briefly the attack because I was kind of running low on time, but I think it's kind of cute. So let me just show you the attack. It will be clear. I don't need to remind you the definition. So here is what the attacker does, right? The attacker flips a random coin, samples is a 0 to then, 1 to then, and basically that will be x1. And then the attacker forgets what it did. He says, I flip the coin, I output, but I forgot it. So there is one bit of entropy. The attacker generally doesn't remember what he chose. So the state over here, it's either pi of 0 to then or pi of 1 to then. So the second state, the attacker will use the fact that it actually can evaluate pi. So this is Oracle dependent setting. It will evaluate pi of 0 pi of 1, XOR them, flip a coin and either give you 0 to then or pi of 0 plus pi of 1. And immediately forget it. Okay? So now if you see nothing really changes. Distribution-wise, nothing changes. Pi of 0 flips to pi of 1 over here. So they kind of either flip or not, but distribution-wise, nothing really changes. So there is still one bit of entropy in the state, even though I injected 2 bits of entropy. So you rate pi, and you can see the same. I inject another bit of entropy, but nothing really changes. You just kind of flip those things from pi square of 0 to pi square of 1. Nothing really changes, right? You see it's a little bit subtle. I just want to make sure. Right? So you do it for any number of steps you want. On steps, I don't care what the formalized procedure does. At the end, you basically have, you extract it from one bit of entropy. So essentially, if my state just remembers this powerful 0, powerful 1, it's clear that the distribution generally has L bits of entropy because I forgot those coins. Those coins I completely forgot. So there is like L bits of entropy under any reasonable definition, including ours. So this kind of is insecure. Anyway, this just shows you that this is not a completely trivial definition. It requires some kind of thought and, hopefully it's the right one. And you can see the flavor of things. Let me very briefly mention secure constructions and maybe spend the last 10 minutes on something else. Yeah.
How is it related to like indifferentiability domain extension of random oracle, like constructing
we don't have a formal connection. The constructions seem to be you're right. I mean, some who coincidentally things which are not indifferentiable, we have attacks. I don't have a formal thing. The definitions are sufficiently different from this entropy and conditioning on the list. Some who, I mean, I think that, if I think for like 5 more minutes, I will give you examples in those directions, probably that they're incomparable. But you're right, there is some, they are probably more secure. But yeah, there is some correlation between the secure constructions and the random oracle, domain extension attacks in differentiability. But I'm pretty sure it's just a coincidence, just because it's, Merkel-Damgard is such a good construction, it like works for everything, collision resistance, like PRL, whatever. So anyway, so the first one is just Merkel-Damgard construction. So instead of like CBC, we just use actually a compressing hash function. In this case, from YSS. And this is actually secure. In information theoretic sense, this is actually not secure if you don't truncate it, but if you just truncate the output a little bit by security parameter bits, it becomes secure. So this is kind of one result. And the proofs, I mean, I stated as a trivial things. Unfortunately, that's a downside. He has a model with like queries and keeping track of the queries. The proofs are, I mean, this paper, I think it's like overall like maybe like 90 pages long with all the results. But the good news, you do the proofs once and forget about it, and hopefully we didn't make any mistakes in our proofs. But it's unfortunately not like, in the toy example, this monolithic random oracle, everything was easy. Here it was kind of painful, but we've done it. So anyway. So information theoretic version, we have the truncate. We analyzed also something called HMAC. It was like super painful, but Hugo called me and said, no, I need like HMAC because that's what everybody is using. So we had to like do another painful like 10-page proof for HMAC, but anyway, it works. Davis Meyer, if you want to look inside and say, oh, in reality, the compression function of SHA-2 is like has some kind of block cipher. Also works with another 10-page proof. I'm sorry. It's like sponge SHA-3. Of course, Stefano, part of the paper said, no, we have to do SHA-3. So SHA-3 basically uses a sponge. So it's very similar to CBC, except there is part of the state which is not XORed. It turns out to be completely essential. Once you have the part of the state which is not XORed, and you also cannot output as a subtlety, you cannot output both because otherwise you can invert. But anyway, if you invert only the top, it's secure. So basically, and that's exactly what SHA-3 actually recommends for the extraction mode. So that was like a perfect match. I mean, they kind of heuristically did the right thing, but we formalized it in the setting. Yeah. Yeah, I feel there should be some composition on. At that stage, the proofs were very similar, but there were critical changes in places. So at the end, we just gave up. We said, listen, we'll do it once. We don't, but yeah, I think probably if we spent more time, this project took 2 years overall to complete with us being in different places and so on. So probably there is something we just did everything from scratch for every construction, but yeah. Probably, most likely. So very briefly, applications to single PRNGs. And the answer is yes. So with some tweaks, I talked to you about one-time extraction. In reality, you will do this multiple-time extraction. With some tweaks, it works even for, instead of a line extractor, it works for full PRNG with input. And the main difference is that you should be able to produce multiple outputs. So what changes, instead of the finalized procedure, you have to have what is called a next procedure. Right, so you take a state, not only the output's output, but you tell you how to update the state, and you can keep going. Right, and the attacker can interchange refresh and next, call in any kind of order. So you will go full PRNG, and the security model is a pain to define, but you can do it also. And this model is called an arbitrary order and so on. And the important thing here, which is gave us a lot of glue, but that's kind of important in practice, is to recover from state compromise. If at any point the state of RNG is cloned, maybe you have some kind of state replication attacks because virtual machines or whatever practical things, if enough fresh entropy is injected, it should recover at any point. So this is intuitively what we have. So this is for example, the tweak. So for example, with minor tweaks, we can do it. For example, for sponge, so refresh stays the same, but the next function, you cannot just output this as sub r. I mean, it's, for the output, if you need to update the state, you cannot just keep it here because it's kind of correlated, but it turns out by doing this thing, and you need to do very essentially this fast forward XOR, but with something somewhat practical that people actually suggested in the past, it works. So so this is the end of this part of the talk, and whatever time Dana or Daniel allows me, I'll do the last part of the talk. So are we done with PRNG? So this is kind of, I'm happy to take questions. So this was a practical thing about using cryptographic hash functions, justifying what people do in practice. Are we done with PRNGs? And somewhat surprisingly, there was a whole dimension. I was working in this area for 15 years. And then I randomly meet, Niels Ferguson, and he's like, he makes a random remark, I was like, what are you talking about? And then it turns out into a couple of kind of crypto papers. So I was like, an expert supposedly, but didn't know about it at all. But anyway, what is it? So we don't have, there is this thing is like, we don't really have time. The interrupts happen such a fast pace. We cannot evaluate, even though SHA is fast, we cannot afford to evaluate SHA for every interrupt. There is no way you can do it. So here is a heuristic solution. I worked a lot on this animation. So for every interrupt, you use, you basically split refresh into two parts, what we call fast refresh and slow refresh. That's not how Windows and Apple call it, and Linux or whatever. Every operating system has it. They don't give it a name. It's just kind of part of it. So you do something fast. And you update, so R is like what is called a register. You update like a register, and then less frequently, when the computer is asleep or whatever, every few seconds, or maybe after some number of interrupts, you apply actually a cryptographic hash function, and that's what actually a user consumes. So the state is what is confused. But there is this whole component which is very heuristic here, where we need to do something cheap and dirty to solve the problem of super fast entropy connection. So in particular, here is, for example, what Windows and Apple do. And Linux will do something slightly different, but related. So you have a bunch of, so the goal is like, here, think about it as individual timing of interrupts. You want to apply iteratively some fast function, which has some heuristic or hopefully not so heuristic entropy accumulations. There is a little bit of entropy, but somehow you still accumulate this entropy despite the fact that you're super fast. So let's look, and one thing that I want to say here to connect it with a big thing, here, this is not the final extraction. Final extraction will be done here using SHA and so on. So we don't really need extraction. We just need entropy accumulation. So technically, condensers say, no, we don't need extractors, right? And that will allow us to get much better results in terms of concrete bounds and so on. So zooming in, for example, what Windows does, they have rotating sort construction. So this is a super fast entropy accumulator. You take the current register, 32 bit, you take the current timing of interrupts, you rotate, first you take the register and you rotate it, then you XOR them, and this is your next register. So Ri plus 1 is rotate of Ri plus Xi. So this is what we can do like in 5 cycles inside the computer for every interrupt, and that's the most they can allow. I don't know, there was like some kind of fight that Neil Ferguson got over this, but he can say, yeah, I cannot do anything more than this. This is like the limit of what I was allowed to do by operating systems guys. And specifically, even the constants are very, so for example, Windows is using rotation by 5 on 32-bit architecture and rotation by 19. Over here, you can ask why 5 and 19, what if I change it to 6? Will be a horrible idea, don't do it. 7 actually slightly better, that's what Apple uses. So yeah, but like 11 would be horrible. So somehow there was like this magic of these numbers that makes it like very different. So we tried to understand what the hell is going on. So this is kind of the series of papers from last year. But the big point is security of fast refresh here must cut corners. We cannot allow the super generous attackers because the extractor is so simple. There is nothing. So we have to cut corners, but hopefully make something practically relevant. And this kind of leads us to the thing. So in order to cut corners, we used both of those abstractions. I don't know if this is the right way, but we kind of both limited the class of sources and weakened security. Specifically, we assume for these things that the sources are independent. Of course, in reality, it might not be true, but just to get something to justify this numbers heuristically, and also condensing was enough, right? So condensing was enough. We don't need full power of extraction. We just need to accumulate entropy. And this is like my favorite part. I will not, I will just, in the last 2 minutes, just tell you the results and move to conclusions. But the cool thing about it, we started with something super practical. It was like used by Windows and Apple with like these numbers and like clock cycles and something like that. And to analyze it like formally, when we abstracted our model, we used like, not very deep, but still we use techniques from Fourier analysis, like Parseval identity and things like that. So, and actually at the end, turning back to practice where we had like particular plots that I'm going to show you in 2 minutes, where you will see which actually rotation numbers get better to others. So it was like totally cool, the theory, how the super low level questions that came really from practice. So this is a summary of this paper, the last technical slide, well, not technical, just a summary slide, and I'll take questions and move to conclusions. Sorry if I'm 2 minutes over. So we have like these 2 papers, they're complementary, they look at different aspects of this super fast entropy accumulation. So the crypto paper, it looked at this very practical thing, it restricted to transformations which are basically permutation matrices plus XOR. So rotation is a specific permutation matrix, but we allowed like other permutation. which said like, listen, permuting bits is fast, anything kind of more complicated probably we cannot do. And here, just for last ITC, we said, let's allow arbitrary linear transformation. So measure of efficiency was arbitrary linear. Of course, linear could be quadratic, and not linear, but it's okay, just kind of an abstraction. We wanted to see what really works here. So here, we really concentrated on concrete efficiency, like how fast do you accumulate entropy, like, exact lots of entropy accumulation. Here was asymptotic. So here we looked at the arbitrary mean entropy distributions with a caveat, very important caveat. Unfortunately, otherwise, these caveats are kind of necessary because there are possibilities, we assumed IID. So the doctor can choose one distribution of mean arbitrary distribution, what one is chooses, like every timing of interrupts has to come IID from this distribution. Again, kind of ridiculous, but you expect you need something ridiculous to prove something, otherwise there are impossibility results. In the other paper, we defined something, we were focused on timing of interrupts because that's what Microsoft uses. We wanted to abstract the family of distributions that it captures, and we came up with something called two monotone. It includes like Laplacian, Gaussians, uniform distribution. Basically, it's a distribution where there is the most likely timing of interrupts, and the further away you go from it, it kind of drops arbitrarily. So it's like a distribution with at most one peak. We feel that's a good enough abstraction, and then so our results kind of show that rotation works. Theoretically it works, but maybe not super fast for any kind of alpha which is relatively prime to n. So it works for any kind of rotation. And here in this level of generality, all alphas are the same. So it doesn't, you can easily see because linear transformations can map anything to anything. So, so here all of them are kind of the same, but it only works for special numbers. So it was something, extraction works, we found some condition like invariant subspaces. Anyway, maybe this later the details are not important, but we found some effectively necessary and sufficient condition for this entropy accumulation of this regime. We found a condition on the linear matrix such that at least asymptotically extraction works on this IID kind of family. And here we define some combinatorial property called covering number, allows us to compare this notation, and I'll just show you the pictures. So we computed the property, combinatorial property of these different permutation matrices, and so this is a picture. This is the last thing that I'll show you. So this is for alpha equals 5. So this is Microsoft choice, and this is alpha equals 7, which is chosen by Apple. So the lower bound, the black thing is a lower bound. It's like the best you can do. So intuitively, you have k bits of entropy at a time. You need at least n over k steps to accumulate like n minus 1 bits of entropy. This is like what this plot shows. So this is a lower bound, and you can see that the red numbers are coming like relatively close over here with various kind of things. So we really kind of looked at the rate of convergence in practice. So it was kind of cool that we used Fourier analysis to compute this kind of things. Some picture for alpha equals 19, and actually yes, Microsoft choice of 19 turned out to be pretty good. Well, basically one of the best. We couldn't find any other rotation amount. So heuristically, they came up with something pretty good. We also came up with a theoretical permutation for all this rotation hours. We just computed covering number by brute force and just argued that they're good. But theoretically, we would like to say, listen, if n goes to infinity, what is the right permutation? We couldn't prove the result for rotations that require some deep techniques in analytic number theory, which at least we don't know at the time. It's like, this modular arithmetic, it like looks super complicated. But in theory, we did come up with something called bit reverse rotation, which is like a simple permutation. I'll just show you the picture. There is a homogenization. So we showed with a permutation which you can prove a theoretical results that its covering number is always, basically the best. And all those rotation matrices. And, anyway. So last slide before tomorrow. So I will finally done, not even close. So what Harish will tell you tomorrow about this last aspect, but I'm not going to tell about it today. Just the last aspect of this practical RNG design is something called premature next problem, is how to eat your entropy and have it too. If you're curious to know what it is, come to Harish's talk, but this is used in practical, like in Windows and Apple RNG it's used, but Linux decided not to use it. There was a heated discussion and on the mailing list like a couple of months ago, and they decided it's not an important problem for them to protect. But anyway, so I thought it was kind of a pretty cool journey, which allowed us to prove cool results for this community, use like few techniques from diverse areas, but also make it, apply to practice. There are these real-world implications. We're actually looking at security widely used constructions. It combines theory and practice in both directions. One punchline is that seedless PRNGs are important. And hopefully it's we are close. We are closing the gap to make it a more mature field. So I'll stop here.
So I guess your theorem of that about independent exercise is probably.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
He's aware. Yeah, I'm also not monitoring the chat, or somebody should just pick up later, but yeah.
So you had the theorem about the independent exercise. There's.
Yeah. So we pretty critically used full independence. There is something we are mulling over right now. There is a result. I forgot by whom, but you probably know something like super surprising to us that for like Santa-Vazirani sources, we should be like a model where there is kind of it's not really conditional independence, but there is only entropy. You cannot build extractors, you cannot build condensers, but you can build conduct from Santa-Vazirani sources. So you're kind of looking at this kind of thing. I mean, I don't know if it's in the line of thought that you're thinking, but removing independences in this line of work is the biggest thing. Is just staying in the super efficient regime. It's, there is this very fine line between possibility result. But yeah, that would be fascinating. If you're interested, I mean, there was a cool combinatorics, you would be like, absolutely, I mean, we use whatever Fourier analysis we could. I mean, it's, you would, I personally would love to chat about it. Yeah.
Sure, let's.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.